Digging into Data, a hands-on workshop for community arts organisations. I'm Peter Pavement, and I'm going to take you through this presentation today. And to start off, I'm just going to introduce myself and really show that I'm not really a data person. My career started off completely somewhere else, and I just use data as part of my work in the cultural sector and design. So originally, I was a graphic designer working in publishing, and I used to live in the UK. You might detect my accent as you're listening to this. And I worked with a number of publishers, and I was involved in small publishing houses. And I also worked for the British Broadcasting Corporation, helping them to design and implement their early websites. And then in 2001, I founded my company, Surface Impression, which is a digital agency that specializes in work for the cultural sector. And so that's anything from theatres to museums, archives, to the behind-the-scenes arts organisations like Arts Etobicoke. But as part of that work, in around 2005, I started to work with Google Analytics, which had emerged in that year, and undertook a project with a number of museums in London that was called the London Hub of Museums. And that was the first time I realised that data could be really helpful in making a difference for cultural sector audiences. And then subsequently, I ended up doing a PhD at the University of Leicester that was all about the assembly of media by museums. And then I've also been mentoring organisations through all sorts of different aspects of digital. And initially that was working with a program called Let's Get Real, and working with the British Council. And subsequently, I moved to Canada and started to work with organisations like Arts Etobicoke, and also programs like Data Shy to Data Driven and Mass Culture. And finally, I became a citizen in 2024, so I'm here to stay in Canada. So what is data? So data is around us. It's everywhere. It's something that we're using on a day-to-day basis. In fact, today, you probably check the weather. That's data. You might have checked transport or transit. That's also data. You might have had to go somewhere special or just go to work, or you're staying at home. But either way, there's a very high likelihood that you've already engaged with data before dealing with this presentation today. So if we ask ourselves, what is it? It turns out it's actually quite a fuzzy edge concept. There's not a complete agreement about what data means, but there is certainly common aspects in the discussion around it. So data often centers around a value or a set of values. And there are techie language around that. You have things like a datum. A datum is like a single unit of data. And actually, technically, the plural is data. So, and then there's the pronunciation. Some say data, some say data. We don't really care how you say it, but it's definitely an irregular plural noun. So it's like sheep. But it also is part of a system. So data can be taken as the raw facts, the values, the measurements, etc. That can be structured. It can be unstructured. But that's your raw material. So basically, it doesn't become something that you use until it's information. So it's data in context, something that has been given meaning and filtered for relevance. Or it is going up a level into becoming knowledge. So knowledge is an understanding of the significance through experience, study, association and comprehension of all of that, of the data and the information. There's another model for this, a pyramid. So as you can see from this, the lower level is data, and then you have information, and then you have knowledge, and at the very top of that is wisdom. It's knowledge put into action. So let's have a look at working with data. So in the field of data, we've often used the 5 steps that you see on the screen here as a framework to help organize programs. So We start with questions and strategy. Then we have sourcing and cleaning, analysis and visualization, communication, and finally decisions. And if we look at that, it's not always a straight line process. It's not a linear process necessarily. There's always iteration. So it may be that you set questions and strategy, but then when you come to source and clean your data, you realize that you need to revisit your questions and strategy. Or you may get to analysis and visualization, but also realize that that's telling you something that needs to be reiterated through questions and strategy. So there are a lot of loops. And if we carry that on to its logical extreme, you may find that you're looping round and round this process as you go. But overall, it has this step-by-step trajectory. So let's start with the questions. So it's always a good idea to start broad in scope. And multiple questions are definitely fine. You can ask a lot of different things as long as there's a thread between them that makes sense. And it should align with your organizational mission, strategy, goals, or tactics. So that gives you a lot of room all the same. There's quite a big difference between mission, the kind of core reason that your organization exists, and tactics, the things that you're doing to get that mission done. But one thing that really helps is to organize your questions. So once you've written them all down, you start to kind of shuffle them around till you have them organized into primary and secondary questions. So let's look at some of the types of questions. So you have exploratory. So that's something where you're trying to understand something in more detail. For example, what are the characteristics of international visits to our gallery? Or you have predictive. So that's using past data and sources that you might get from outside of your organization to estimate or predict future performance. So an example of that might be, what would be the potential audience reach of a campaign on TikTok? So you are looking to see what would happen if you did that. Comparative. So this is where you're looking at some occurrence or aspect and comparing it with another. So that could be over time, it could be place, it could be different groups, it could be different factors of a single item. So an example here is, how are purchasing patterns in our shop different to pre-COVID times? That's a comparative question. Another type is relationship. So exploring the correlations or influences between data variables. So for example, from which neighborhoods in our city are people more likely to take up membership? So that's really looking at those relationships between parts and relationships to you. One thing that people often ask are, what should I be doing, qualitative data or quantitative data? And actually, we're not that worried. Both qualitative and quantitative data work very well for a lot of different circumstances. And that actually quantitative data is often based on qualitative judgment. So really, they can be interchangeable, especially since you can actually process qualitative data to make it quantitative. So these divisions are somewhat artificial. We think just carry on regardless. So let's look at data sources. There are three main categories of data source. So there's data we have already, data that someone else has, and data that we need to get. And if we drill into these, data that you have already might be a membership list. It could be web traffic like Google Analytics. It could be ticket sales or retail sales or timesheets, the activities of staff members. And to get hold of that, you might have to liaise with colleagues or export data from systems or coordinate with your suppliers and vendors. Data someone else has might be the census. It might be the weather. It could be boundaries, so geographic boundaries, like the postal code areas, for example. It could be consumer data, so information that's been gathered through surveys or purchasing that other organizations hold. It could be sector data. To get hold of that, you can check open data sources, of which there are many. You can look at commercial suppliers. There are organizations that will sell you data. You can also connect with arts service organizations, such as Arts Etobicoke and other nonprofits who often are gathering and working with data. And then data we need to get includes surveys, focus groups, new measurements, things that don't yet exist as data. So you're reaching out to produce this. And the activities that might go behind that are designing surveys, recruiting participants for a focus group, and in looking at the different methods and options that there are for you to gather data in this way. So it's all well and good having data, and lots of organizations do gather a lot of data, but it's not that helpful unless you can connect it to decision making. So your questions, your original questions, are there to support potential decisions and subsequent actions. So as you're setting those questions, think about the potential outcomes. And even though you don't yet have the insights from the data, you can still hypothesize, you can still predict potential outcomes and see what that means in your context. But be open to surprises. Reality often changes the game. So let's look at hypotheses. So basically, a hypothesis is making a prediction that you then test with your data. So your hypothesis might be members are the most likely people to make donations. And you might have several of these predictions accompanying your questions. And then as part of this, anticipate the different decisions that you might make, depending on whether your hypothesis turns out to be true or turns out to be false, or it's just inconclusive, which is very common. Often hypotheses don't really have a clear outcome. But either way, if you think about how you might act, that really helps to frame this work and make it more manageable. So a good way of thinking about manageability of data is to use this grid structure. And what you can see on the screen starts with a square that's been divided into 4. And the top left-hand quadrant says how I use data. So if we were workshopping this together, we might have this drawn out on a large piece of paper, and you would put Post-it notes on it to gather together different aspects of your practice or what you would like your practice to be. So for how I use data, you would have one set of things, and then the next square is how I manage data. The next one is how I communicate data, and the last one is how I understand data. And all together, these 4 things make up a literacy. So it's like your data literacy is your ability to use, manage, communicate, and understand data, and they all work together. So for example, using data, you might put Post-it notes for, I use data to report to funders. I use data when I'm making my annual report. I use data to see how a post on social media has done. How I manage data might be, I just leave it in its original software. So if some data's in our ticketing platform, then I just look at it there. Or it might be that you use something like SurveyMonkey, so you have a set of tools. How you communicate data might be something where you're actually putting something together for your board, like a set of slides that tell a bit of a story for them based on the data. It may be an advocacy package where you're going to people outside of your organization and trying to persuade them to do something. And so that's a communication that is based on data. And then how I understand data is basically how do you make this work for yourselves? So it could be that you work with it in a spreadsheet, or that you make graphs and charts, you visualize it. So these are the methods that you use to really inhabit that data and really understand what it is doing for you. So that all takes us to data-driven decisions. And a nice way, again, to make this manageable is to divide it into sections, much as we've been doing before. So if we're turning insight into decisions, you could be doing that for yourself, for your colleagues, or for your stakeholders. So if it's for yourself, divide it into short-term, medium-term, and long-term decision-making. Start small. Don't try and be too ambitious. Just do a small little pilot and work from there. And you can add more as you become more confident. And also reflect on gaps in your information and where bias is present. So there's always bias. We can't escape that, but we can try and mitigate it. So look to see where that might be creeping in. And one way of mitigating is to look for new data or deeper data to help you address that. So activities you can do for yourself, and here we're thinking about how you understand data, for example, is to make a dashboard. So the example on screen shows a series of charts that are part of a dashboard, and it's for a disability arts organisation, and it shows a set of information through 2 pie charts and 3 bar charts that helps that organisation understand the people that are participating in their programs and what those people want from the program, where they came from, and some of the demographic information about them. And that's great. Having a dashboard is really good, and observing your data over time is very good. But another factor in making data manageable is to not spend too much time in the details. So a good principle for that is to establish your parameters from which you can not have to think about things. So I've been calling it your don't worry parameters. So if you look at the chart on the screen here, there's 2 lines drawn across a time series, so basically a graph that is plotted against days. And as we see that, the 2 lines are only traversed by the data at a few points. And so those are the few points when you actually need to care about what's going on. So in this case, we're looking at a couple of spikes and a couple of troughs. So if things fall below a certain level, then you worry about it. If they go above a certain level, then you worry about it. The rest of the time, you just ignore it. And that's a really great principle to make this more manageable. And a way to work with all of these things, including those don't worry factors, is to come up with if-then scenarios. So an example of that might be, if new members in a month exceeds 100, then you identify the source of interest. If event sign-ups are less than 60% of what you expected, then you do an extra push on social media. So those are if-then scenarios. So if something, then something. And dividing it up like that also hopefully makes that more easy to delegate. So that brings us to colleagues. So if we look at working with colleagues, you can think about a life cycle of a decision. So the steps for that life cycle include draft, share, propose, decide, execute, evaluate, and iterate. So if we explain some of those, the draft is exploring a scenario using the methods that we've explored so far. Sharing, so discussing in a meeting, for example. Propose, so pin down a formula or an approach to data or a decision. Decide, so this is actually the moment when you collectively go, what you're doing, when and how. Then you execute, so you run that plan for a set time period, and then you evaluate, so you measure your results, and you go back to the data. And of course, you must iterate. Data and digital definitely depend on iteration. And let's look at evaluating those decisions. So if you're working with your colleagues, a good way to set a kind of regular evaluation is to come up with a simple framework. And a question that's very obvious is, what was the outcome? Was it negative? Was it neutral? Was it positive? What value did it add? How demanding was it on resources? And based on those things, you can start to think about, well, what would we do in the future? And the answer might be, never do that again. That's a perfectly valid answer. But it could be equally, let's do that again. That was great. Let's do it again. But there's always going to be a chance to improve it. So ask yourselves, what can we improve? And there is your route to your iteration. So let's look at stakeholders next. And for stakeholders, a really good place to start is with your data story. So think about, what is your data story? Is it a problem to be solved? An opportunity to be pursued? A trend? A success to be celebrated? These are all ways to frame data in a narrative, and so therefore tell a data story. So you can also link that to a call to action. So the data story leads to an action. So the problem to be solved, the action is focus resources here. An opportunity to be pursued, let's fill the gap or invest in an idea. A trend, that is seize the moment or stop the rot. A success to be celebrated, see how good we are. So these are all ways that you can turn some of those things into actions. And a way that organizations, and especially stakeholders like funders, for example, interact with organizations is to set different data thresholds, different data evaluation points. And one framing for that is key performance indicators. I'm not particularly keen on KPIs as a thing. I think they are too single dimension, but they are definitely something that are widespread. So an example up here on the screen, or three examples we've got up here on the screen are web visits or volunteers or shop income. So these are basically three sets of information, and there are some thresholds there. And we have 226,000 sessions, and that is up 44%. Or we have 115 volunteers, and that's up 17%. But also we have our shopping income is $45,000, and that's down 72%. So there's a lot of information coming through, some simple lines of information here, but it is often used as a stick to beat up people with, to really make their working life a bit of a misery, to set targets that are not attainable. It can be quite a negative way to communicate between colleagues or stakeholders and organizations. A more subtle version, which allows for qualitative aspects to be integrated, is called objectives and key results. And this is a collaborative approach that sets goals, qualitative goals, that have measurable quantitative outcomes. And it allows you to combine metrics into a single concept with quality and quantity assessed together. And you can apply this at any level, but it is actually a really good driver of organizational mission. So it's also a useful tool for working with stakeholders such as senior management or a board or a funder or an audience group or a municipality. Any given stakeholder, you can frame your story, your mission, qualitative aspects and quantitative aspects together, and that all works within one framework: objectives and key results. So an example of that is that your objective, your strategic objective could be to deliver high quality programming for all people living in our community. And that's a sentence that we see in a lot of mission statements or variations thereof. So the key result, what would actually support that? How would you know that you are delivering high quality programming for all the people living in your community? Well, a key result might be increasing visits from certain postal codes. So you could say our key result is increase visits from these three postal codes by 10%. Or another key result might be quality ratings from participants. So it may be 70% of your respondents rate quality as 7 or above. And a final key result might be that you deliver more. So it might be that you run an additional 8 events in the 3 most popular categories with your audience. So these are all key results that support that overall objective. But by splitting it into parts, no one of those becomes too heavy or too much of a thing kind of chiseled out of stone that the organization must always bow down to. We can really actually focus on the objective rather than the measurement. So that's the end of my presentation. There are lots more resources in this activity that you can dive into. And thank you very much.